Hey everybody, welcome to another installment of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We're nearing the end of the quarter, so I'm just going to tell you the remaining talks that we've got. After this week, next week on the 1st of March, we have Russell Gray from the University of Auckland Department of Psychology and on the pleasures and perils of Darwinizing culture with phylogenies. On March 8th, the final talk of the quarter will have Peter Fashing from Cal State Fullerton Department of Anthropology, and his talk is called Behavioral Ecology of East African Primates, Costs and Benefits of Group Living in Colobus and Gelada Monkey Societies. And then it will be spring break, and we will resume the spring quarter. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Peter Kim from the USC Department of Management and Organization, Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California, who's going to talk to us today about mob mentalities.
It's a pleasure being here today, talking to such a diverse group of attendees. I'm here to talk about something which, lately has become a bit too familiar, perhaps, as evidenced by some of these more recent incidents. You may know some of these more than others, but basically they've all been caught red-handed doing something pretty bad, right? And so these kinds of incidents are reflective of some systematic patterns. And when you look at surveys of sentiments throughout the country, for example, you'll see that 45%, only 45% have confidence in their business leaders today. 39%, only 39% have trust in their senior leaders. 55% believe that their employer violated a psychological contract, so that this reduced trust. And 76% of employees have observed illegal or unethical conduct on the job. These kinds of experiences has led the popular press to observe that it's really seriously eroded the trust that's vital to the proper functioning of social and economic systems. This is a big problem for all of us. What's particularly interesting to us as a partial impetus for this work is the notion that once these transgressions occur, and these people who are caught red-handed or accused of having done something respond, that in some ways it's difficult to gauge or understand the way we ourselves are responding to their explanations or their apologies or what have you. So here's some examples. So former President Bill Clinton, in response to having been caught in this affair with Monica Lewinsky, he first denies the affair, and then apologizes. And we can ask ourselves, why were both responses ineffective? This was clearly very costly for him politically, and yet when we compare his experience with our own governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, we can see that he was accused of having sexually harassed many, many women, and yet despite the fact that his transgressions were more widespread and more unwelcome in Monica Lewinsky, at least was a willing partner, right? And so Bill Clinton has one affair with one willing partner, and he suffers a huge cost politically. Arnold Schwarzenegger has these accusations levied against him, and he's elected governor. Why did his apology work in that instance? And here's a third example in which CBS News is found to have used a forged memo and a story about George Bush's reserve record, and they respond with an apology ultimately. And yet that wasn't the end of the story. The scandal did continue. There was a lot of debate about what was going on here. And so these kinds of experiences for us were illustrating something very important in terms of how little we understand our reactions to these kinds of transgressions, these violations of trust. And that lack of knowledge is actually reflected in the literature that we've been able to explore. So across various literatures, there are all sorts of contradictions that exist. For example, there's this question of whether you should apologize after having committed these kinds of transgressions, or deny the culpability for having committed them, assume more blame for having done something bad, or less. Is it better to say nothing at all in some situations? And what is the role of substantive responses in rectifying these kinds of situations? So the goal for me and my colleagues has been to gain some insight into these mechanisms that govern when or how trust might be repaired after these kinds of transgressions. And we've taken this tack by focusing on the cognitive mechanisms that may explain why these different reactions occur. So it's led to a program of research, and I don't want to, we don't have time to cover all of it, but what I'd like to do, perhaps, to get us grounded in this way of thinking is to talk about some of the earlier research, the foundational research, and then after covering some of that, we can get into this latest study that looks at mob mentalities. Right? So let's dive into the first study in the stream that sort of grounds a lot of our subsequent thinking. It was motivated by the recognition that in the literature that we have observed, there seemed to be a pretty blatant contradiction in terms of recommendations that researchers would offer as a response to a transgression. So some researchers have suggested that the best response after having committed the transgression is to apologize, assume ownership for having committed that transgression, because by assuming ownership for it, you are signaling that you are not only guilty, but also that you're going to fix the problem. You're signaling both guilt and redemption. Other researchers say, no, this is the worst thing you should do, because of the fact that the apology confirms guilt, and that guilt would be horribly damaging to your career. And so there have been a few studies looking at political candidates in experimental situations who apologize for having done something wrong. They find that when they apologize, they're actually worse off than if they had just denied this incident, right? So that denial is better because it doesn't signal guilt. It doesn't signal redemption either, but that guilt is the paramount concern for most people in these situations. And so here's this discrepancy, and it arises from the fact that these responses are double-edged. An apology can signal both guilt and redemption. Denial signals neither guilt nor redemption. And the question is, well, how do we weigh these kinds of signals, and how does that inform the value of an apology relative to a denial? Is one response better than the other, or the conditions under which that relative benefit might be swayed? What we did was pull out upon some other research that looked at the importance of the type of violation, in particular whether the transgression is framed as a matter of competence or integrity. We focus on these two dimensions because when we think about trust, it turns out that trust researchers have identified these as two of the most important qualities for determining trustworthiness. Okay? And they're used to evaluate all sorts of people, potential collaborators, bosses, subordinates, and so on. It's these two criterion are important in basically any interpersonal situation that we've been able to identify in which one person is deciding whether to cooperate with another, make themselves vulnerable to another. And the third reason in which these dimensions are important, and perhaps the most important one, for the sake of this particular study, was the idea that there's some prior research that has suggested that there's some important discrepancies in how we weigh information about competence and integrity. In particular, this idea is that when it comes to matters of competence, we tend to weigh information, positive information about competence, much more heavily than negative information about competence. So if you're a baseball player and you hit a home run, they think of you as a home run hitter even though you might strike out the next time. Right? That positive information about competence is considered more diagnostic than that negative information. But when it becomes a matter of integrity, the reverse seems to be the case. So if you get caught having cheated on your spouse and you say, but I didn't cheat on you yesterday, right? somehow that doesn't work out so well, right? So that one negative instance is considered far more important than the positive instance of integrity here. And so this is important for us because it tells us that the way in which we might respond to the positive and negative signals that an apology, for example, might convey will differ depending on whether it's framed as a matter of competence or integrity. If it's a competence-related issue, well, then an apology might be very useful there because what an apology is doing is providing signals of redemption, positive information about competence that will be weighed very heavily. And the negative information about competence through the confirmation of guilt that you get through the apology is going to be discounted relatively. So in this case, it's that positive information about competence that an apology will convey this positive signal of redemption that will make an apology more effective, particularly effective and more effective than a denial. But if it becomes a matter of integrity, well, then you're in trouble because the apology signaling guilt in addition to redemption, that information about guilt is going to be weighed quite heavily, right? And it's going to be weighed far more heavily than the positive signals of integrity that the apology would convey. For that reason, denial should be a particularly bad response, and in this case, worse than apology. We explored this prediction with a sample of undergraduate students and graduate students in an experiment that manipulated both the type of violation, whether it concerned matters of competence or integrity, and the type of response, whether the person apologized or denied culpability. Right? And the setting was one, this was all before Enron and all that other stuff that happened, so we were particularly lucky in selecting this context. It was a video taped interview that we created in which a job candidate at an accounting firm is found to have misfiled a tax return in her at her former employer. Okay, so, or is at least accused of having done so. Right? And the question is, how does this person respond to this incident? How's the incident framed? And then we measure the extent to which people find this person to be a trustworthy person, and the extent, in terms of competence or integrity, do they have the qualities that are deserving of trust? And then also our trusting intentions. Are you willing to make yourself vulnerable to that person in that situation? So here's how we frame this matter of competence or integrity. In the competence case, it is simply the result of a lack of knowledge about the tax codes. Right? And the way we operationalize integrity is that they did this intentionally. This person did it intentionally to satisfy an important claim. Right? So, and so this is simply the type of violation, and they either apologized or denied culpability for this. I was guilty, I'm truly sorry. I was not guilty, that accusation is false. Okay? And basically what we're exploring is this idea that this interaction between the type of violation and type of response would affect your trusting beliefs. Do they have competence or integrity? And does this subsequently make you more willing to hire that person or give that person responsibilities, risk yourself to that person's subsequent behavior, right, at that job? Right? And so those are indications of trust in this particular case. To explore these questions in the setting, what we also need to demonstrate is that within this, it's an 8-minute long videotape interview. Within that short time period, that people will be able to exhibit somewhat high initial trust in that person, and that simply being accused of having committed that transgression will lower that trust. Okay? There's some evidence from the literature that suggests that's the case, that we tend to trust people. We don't start our interactions with a level of trust at 0, that actually tends to be higher, and then within the first 5 minutes it can be reasonably high. And that accusations, even if they're unfounded, can lower trust in these parties. So we ran an initial pilot study to verify these notions, and we find that that is in fact the case. So if you look at here, in the competence condition before the allegation, on a 7-point scale, 5.64. Right after the allegation, it jumped down to 2.68, and you find that with every other measure that we have. So here, even in this 8-minute-long interview, 5.5 out of 7, pretty high. And there's some variance, but quite a few of them are above 5. So initial trust can be high. The allegation can damage trust. The question is, well, having had this violated trust, does the type of response matter in these different types of situations? We find that it does. So if it's framed as a matter of competence, a competence type violation here, an apology is a very helpful thing. It actually gets you pretty much back to where you were initially. And if you deny culpability, that's not such a good thing. If it's framed as a matter of integrity, apology is devastating. Right? And you're far better off denying culpability. This is for the measure of perceived integrity. Same U-shaped pattern for your willingness to hire. Okay, so the type of violation does affect the value of these different responses. One question that might be raised is, well, is this simply due to the fact that an apology is confirming guilt? It's providing this negative information. So what if you find out whether or not the accusation was true or not? Right? In our theory, though, what we're relying on is not only that we're weighing information about guilt differently depending on whether it's a competence or integrity-based violation, but also how we weight signals of redemption, that we're going to fix the problem, right? And an apology is supposed to signal that as well, that this should be weighed differently based on whether it's a competence or an integrity-based violation. So we predict that even when you provide evidence of innocence or guilt, this interaction should hold, that an apology should be better than denial. For a competence-based violation and an integrity violation, a denial should be better than an apology. It doesn't mean that information about guilt isn't important. Presumably, when you're found innocent, you should be considered more trustworthy than you're found guilty. And it should also be the case that you should be honest, right? If you're guilty, it's better to apologize than deny. If you're innocent, it's better to deny culpability than apologize. So what we're predicting is essentially two-way interactions. We tested this with a sample of undergraduates and graduates again. The design just added another factor, whether you're found innocent or guilty after having responded to this transgression or this allegation. And basically what we simply do is provide information in very official-looking documents that says, well, there's been an investigation through the State Board of Public Accountancy, and they have found this person to be innocent or guilty of having committed this transgression. And so the question is, does that information about innocence or guilt affect your judgments? Turns out we get the exact same pattern, irrespective of whether we provide information about innocence or guilt. For competence-based violations, an apology is helpful. For integrity-based violations, it's a really bad thing. We get this for trusting intentions, whether you would hire this person, and willingness to risk. Essentially, these U-shaped patterns keep occurring again and again. But information about guilt or innocence does matter. In particular, if you're found innocent, the bars on the left-hand corner, left-hand side, are higher than the ones on the right. So it's better to be found innocent than guilty. And also, it's better to be honest than to have lied about your guilt, right? So if you're innocent, it's better to have denied guilt than apologized for it, right? So, and the reverse is the case for if you are guilty, right? It's better to apologize than deny. And that's the case for all our measures. This bell-shaped curve occurs again and again. Yes, question?
Maybe
John?
this is for the discussion period. If you're innocent, why would you have the motivation to apologize?
So practically it makes no sense. But this is just a fully cross design to see if you happen to do it. If, for example, you thought that would be the strategically wise move. If, for example, you believed the earlier study so much that it said it's important to apologize for a competence-based violation, you said, okay, I'm going to apologize even though I'm innocent. It turns out that's not the right strategy. Think about doing that. Thank you. So we get these signals. What are the implications of these studies? Basically, that the benefits of an apology depend on the type of violation, right? And routinely, we get this idea that an apology is helpful for competence-based violations and harmful for integrity-based violations. The results persist even when, irrespective of whether you have information about innocence or guilt, but lying is not the answer, right? Being found to have lied gets you into trouble. So we can use these findings to help understand some of the examples that I showed earlier. So Bill Clinton first denies the affair and then apologizes. Why were both responses ineffective? We can see here that his denial was challenged by subsequent evidence of guilt, the infamous dress that they had found. And then his apology, when he did apologize, was made for something that was clearly framed as an integrity-based violation. He cheated on his spouse and so on. Well, then how do we understand Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Who was also married, right? And he apologizes and it's not so harmful. Well, the important thing here is that he also took an important step and framed the situation differently. I don't know if you recall his statements and his responses after this happened, but he said something very important. He said, you know, I am such an idiot. I thought we were just fooling around. I thought we were kidding around. Boy, is my social barometer terrible. I had no clue that they would be offended by this. I thought we were just playing around, right? He framed the incident as a competence-based violation and then apologized, right? And we know that when you frame it as a competence-based violation, an apology is helpful, right? So at least many of us in the room will still not trust him 100%, but at least it was helpful enough to get him elected. And then this final case, where CBS News is discovered to have used a forged memo about Bush's reserve record. Even though they apologized, the scandal continued. Well, the reason why it continued, at least in my sense of it, is that there was a debate about why that forged memo was used. Was it a competence or integrity-related issue? Because that would affect the extent to which we can consider that CBS trustworthy or not in the future, right? Did they use this forged memo by accident? Were they duped? Or were they using it to pursue some sort of agenda, right? They knew it was fake and they were using it to pursue some agenda. Well, that's an important question, right? And it affects our ability to respond to this incident, and our different inferences about the incident will, of course, lead to different reactions about whether they should be trusted in the future. Let me give you another example that delves into this a little bit further. So let's say you are guilty and you choose to apologize. Well, that's not a simple response as apology. Apologies can take many forms, and you can apologize in a way that assumes more blame or less. Right? You can make it, I did it, I'm sorry, but something made me do it. Or I did it, I'm sorry, and it's all my fault. Right? Well, this is an important distinction for us to make because the literature, again, has an enormous contradiction about the way you should pursue this apology. Some say it's better to shirk blame, all right? So I'm sorry, but really it's not all my fault. Others say it's better to assume ownership for this transgression because by assuming ownership, in a way you're signaling that you're going to fix this in the future. The interesting thing for us is that the very theory that justify this idea of weighing information about competence or integrity differently leads to an internal contradiction. So let me explain this. So based on what I've just reported before, it suggests that if it is a competence-based violation, right, that it's better to make an internal attribution while you're apologizing rather than an external attribution, because you want to say that, yes, this is all my fault, I am sorry, I'm going to fix this in the future. By making an internal attribution, you're saying that you're taking ownership for this transgression and you're going to rectify it in the future. So an internal attribution should be better than an external attribution when it becomes a matter of competence. When it becomes a matter of integrity, though, well, the blame is the most devastating part of an apology. For an integrity violation, you want to shirk blame as much as possible in that case. So it's more important to shirk blame by making an external attribution for an for integrity transgression than to assume ownership. Problem is that we may be, the opposite pattern may occur when we think about how likely these excuses are likely to be believed. So the reason why we put much more emphasis on positive information about competence than negative information about competence is that we believe that, if you're a competent person, even if you're very competent, all sorts of things can get in the way of you performing well in a given day. Right? When it becomes a matter of integrity, we believe that, even people who lack integrity can perform ethically in certain situations if there are enough incentives to perform ethically. If there's surveillance, or if there are sufficient incentives to perform ethically, then even an unethical person can cooperate. Okay? So if you're the Pope, it'd be hard to think about what we can do to make the Pope commit a mugging or a murder. Right? Is there any external inducement that can create that lack of integrity? We don't believe that people with high integrity can be affected by the situation in that way. So to say that the external environment made me commit an act of low integrity, well, we're just not likely to believe it, right? It's just going to be less plausible. But if someone with high competence doesn't perform well, we believe that lots of things could have gotten in the way, right? Barry Bonds might have had a serious injury, right? We believe that a serious injury could lead someone with high integrity to perform poorly. Those external forces are considered valid rationales for why that might happen. So when it comes to matters of how much we're going to believe these explanations, it turns out that the reverse pattern holds. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, is it more important to focus on the necessity of these explanations or the believability of these explanations, right? Is it better to say that I had an affair, but I was drunk at the moment, right? Even though we might be less likely to believe that that kind of alcohol inducement would induce that kind of transgression. Explored this with a sample of undergraduates, same procedure as earlier studies, and the response was simply, do you make an internal attribution, is all my fault, or an external attribution? It was partly influenced by the situation, and here's some transcripts that sort of describe this. I was partly guilty. I would have not have committed the violation had I not been misinformed about the tax codes. I was partly guilty. I wouldn't have committed the violation if I hadn't been pressured by my superiors. Right? So here are cases in which they're making an external attribution, an internal attribution, something that just as it's all my fault. And what we find here is that when it's a matter of competence, an internal attribution is more effective than an external attribution. When it becomes a matter of integrity, it's sort of the reverse pattern, these U-shaped patterns, which basically tells us that necessity is more important than believability in the nature of this response. Our tendency to react so negatively to someone who's guilty of an integrity-based violation suggests that even an excuse that is going to be discounted is better than offering no excuse at all and taking full blame. So we get these interactions, and it creates this weird dilemma for us, right? So there are cases, because of these patterns, that we might be considered less trustworthy even though we offer an honest response, right? So if we are guilty of an integrity-based violation and it was all our fault and we want to say it was all me, that may actually be a harmful thing, right? Or you may have engaged in deception and said it was due to some external pressure, and you may actually repair trust as a result of being dishonest in your response in explaining that situation. I'm going to talk about one more study quickly and then get into the group study. This study looked at how how these responses are double-edged in nature, and if that's the case, well, maybe it's better in some cases to say nothing at all, right? Pleading the fifth. Our intuitive prediction is that if you say nothing at all, you'll have neither the benefits of signaling redemption or the costs of signaling guilt, acknowledging guilt, right? So if it's a competence-based violation, you don't get the benefits of signaling the positive information about redemption, and you don't have the same sort of negative implications of reticence, not saying anything for an integrity-based violation as apologizing in this case here. In general, you have neither the pros or the cons of offering these double-edged responses. But we can draw on another theoretical perspective that may help inform this further. And basically, the idea of this alternative perspective is that we don't act as rational information processors in making assessments of others or of situations. Rather than doing that, we actually follow this odd process where our initial gut reaction is to believe what is being presented before us. And it's only after time and reflection that we can subsequently process this counterfactual information and subsequently disbelieve it, right? So if someone tells us that they can fly, our initial reaction is to say, "You can?" And then only after a second say, "Wait, that doesn't sound right?" So we don't follow a rational process in processing information. It's rather this two-stage process. If it is this two-stage process, then we have a very different prediction. That the idea here is that if you're going to if there's a competence-based violation, right, and you don't say, "I'm sorry, I'm going to fix it in the future," there's no evidence that you're affording to say that that leads the other side to disbelieve it, right? To update their initial impression that you're guilty by saying nothing at all. You offer none of that positive information that's so important for a competence-based violation. When it becomes a matter of integrity, right, saying nothing at all just leads them to stick with that initial belief that you are guilty, and so you're not offering this counterpoint to say, "I didn't do it at all." If that's the case, then reticence should be the worst response in all cases. We explored this with a sample of graduate students, and here we have a third type of response. In addition to apologies and denials, we offer a case in which they just don't offer a response. I don't want to offer a response here. And what we find in general, there's a little bit of noise in the data, a little bit more noise in the data, but in general what we find is that with perceived integrity, hiring, and willingness to risk, in general the offer of reticence tends to be significantly different from the optimal response, but not significantly better than the suboptimal response. Overall, reticence is significantly worse than the effective response, not significantly better than the ineffective response. And it provides some indication that there's more than just this information diagnosticity issue going on, that there's this process in which we filter information that may be important for us to understand how we're reacting to these different kinds of responses. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background. Let me move on to the study that I wanted to focus more of our attention on today. And this was inspired by some I think there was a quote that I had read in this book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, that really it had an example of someone during the witch hunts of early modern Europe, remarking that, okay, witches may be bad, but you know what? Some of the people who are persecuting people who are accused of having been witches, they're just as bad, right? That maybe there's this overreaction to these kinds of allegations, we're not following due process and so on. So there's this distinction between how we react as a collective and how we might react as individuals. And this kind of distinction gets played out in all sorts of writings. So Hobbes's Leviathan talks about how we as individuals are corrupt and we tend to do these horrible things, so we need our collective institutions to rein us in a bit, right? There's this idea, at least in the US judicial system, that we want to be judged by a jury rather than by individuals. So we don't want just a single judge sentencing us. We want to be judged by a jury of our peers. And this has led to some research that's found a number of inconsistencies with regard to whether judges are are harsher than juries, juries harsher than judges, or does it depend on a variety of factors that we have yet to understand. Even more recently, we have a case in which the Scottish Justice Secretary releases the Lockerbie bomber on humanitarian grounds. We see that individual's decision is very different than the collective reactions that we had. But we think this is a really terrible idea. We're much harsher as a collective than that person was as an individual. And these kinds of discrepancies between how we might act individually and how we might act collectively led to this question of, well, are we better off being judged by individuals or groups? And then if we are if we are a perceiver, how are our own assessments affected by that individual versus group context? And so we wanted to explore when these individual group differences might arise, why they might arise, when they might arise. Problem is that research on group behavior, at least in the literatures that we had examined, the social psychology literature in particular, the organizational behavior literature, they don't offer enough insight for us to move, a whole lot of insight to move forward. There's a lot of research in the group literature that talks about how, for many kinds of tasks, groups have the potential to be better than individuals. Lots more information, they can use more perspectives and ideas, and so on. But there are all sorts of things that get in the way, basically. That's the basic thrust of that literature. There are all sorts of information sharing biases. We tend to be lazier in a group context, and so on. But for matters of judgment, and this idea of whether to trust someone or not is, in effect, a judgment task, there's far less clear research that will tell us what will happen. There's the basic notion, that the basic theme from this literature is that groups can be more extreme than individuals. But in this particular context, what does being more extreme really mean? Right? So does it lead to there's some literature that talks about groups being riskier than individuals, more willing to take risks. Well, does that mean that groups are more willing to trust that person? Because trust is, in this essence, the idea that you're willing to make yourself vulnerable to the other party in situations involving risk, right? Or does that mean that groups will be more risk averse, right? By saying that we're not going to trust this person. Does that difference always occur, or are there contingencies that affects the likelihood of that occurring? Why might this occur? And if it does occur, is there anything we can do on a pragmatic level to try to address these issues? Ultimately, we needed to dig deeper into to find answers into these questions. And we started the process by drawing on some theoretical work that I'd done with some colleagues that basically looked at the process of judging someone as trustworthy or untrustworthy as, in essence, a negotiation of identity, where one party may think that they're trustworthy and others may think that they're not, and the tactics that each side might implement to change the other's opinion will ultimately get resolved into some assessment of whether that person is trustworthy or not. So there's this tension here, right, between an observer and a target, and the question is what each side can do to alter the relative strengths of these forces. Well, if that's what's going on in any assessment of trustworthiness, then one idea is that, well, if you have more people on your side as observers, having more observers judging that party, that it'll ultimately strengthen the observer's sentiments, right? So, and there are lots of mechanisms that might be at play here. The idea that in a group setting, you're more likely to express arguments that will influence the other, and so if one person has a particular reason to think that you shouldn't be trusted and that you're a scoundrel, well, that will affect the opinions of the others once that's expressed. The idea that emotions can be contagious, right? And so if the person that's really, really upset may vent, and those emotions may infect the other people in the group informing this assessment. There's also an idea by Robert Axelrod, who talked about metanorms, which is simply the idea that in some situations you may be more tolerant of what happened, but in a group setting you're reluctant to express that tolerance because you're worried that others might think you condone that behavior, right? So there are a number of reasons why in a collective setting you may be harsher in your assessment of a transgressor than you might be individually. And so if that group polarization occurs, well, our notion is that it should occur in a particular direction where groups should be harsher than individuals in reaction to this transgression. But beyond that, we also expected individuals and groups to be quite similar. With regard to the interaction between the type of violation and response that we talked about before, this interaction has been found in every single one of our studies, irrespective of whether you're testing undergraduates or graduate students. We have data in Singapore, in Japan, exact same pattern is occurring. The way you're responding is affected by the type of violation. If that's the case, then our prediction is that both individuals and groups will be subject to that interaction. Right? So they're going to be similar in that way. And yet, there should also be a relative difference that might be affected by this individual versus group context. In particular, our thinking was that, well, maybe it's not the case that groups are just going to be harsher than individuals, but rather that the group context is going to magnify whatever individual sentiment might be there initially. So if someone offers an effective response, for example, if they apologize for a competence-based violation and an individual perceiver is predisposed to forgive them, well, maybe in a group setting that will be expanded further. So you might actually be more forgiving in a group context than in an individual context if they offer the appropriate response, right? If they apologize for a competence-based violation, which has been found to be effective, or if they denied culpability for an integrity-based violation, which has been found effective, and that it's only when they offer the wrong response, right? And individual perceivers are likely to think negatively of that person as a result that the group magnification, that lever, will lead groups to be much harsher than individuals, right? So hence the third prediction that this relative harshness, groups will be harsher than individuals after a suboptimal response, but less harsh after an optimal response. We wanted to explore whether this process occurs through the expression of persuasive arguments. We actually studied, measured some other potential mediators as well to get at the social norms, the meta-norms idea and emotions, but this one is the one that was most tractable in our data analyses, and actually we do find support for that. I'll mention that in a minute. So if groups are more lenient than individuals, is it because that there are more positive supportive arguments expressed in that group context? If they're harsher than individuals, is it driven by these negative sentiments that are expressed in that group context? And then there's this pragmatic question of, well, okay, if groups do tend to be harsher than individuals in some cases, is there anything you can do to mitigate this effect, right? And so you might, as an individual who has committed a blunder, talk to the individual members of the group first before they reach a group assessment. would that help, right? Or would you talk, what would happen if you talk to those individual members after the group assessment was performed? Will those individual conversations lead to an updating of that decision about whether you're trustworthy or not? We explored these questions in a large-scale study. This is probably the most daunting study I've ever run, 673 undergraduates. Each session lasted an hour and a half because they ran through this process twice. They were exposed to this incident in which the job candidate apologized or denied culpability for a competence or integrity-based violation. And then they made this assessment as an individual or a group, but they either did it first individually and then did it again as a group, or then did it first as a group and then did it individually after the job test.
How large were the groups?
They were 3 to 6 people. What we find is that the idea that groups tend to be harsher than individuals is supported. Generally, this downward trend, the lighter bar is groups being less trusting than individuals in general, in terms of perceived integrity and your willingness to hire that person. The idea that groups and individuals are similar in terms of responding to this interaction of violation type and violation response, that was also supported by these U-shaped patterns, right? So if it's a competence-based violation, an apology is helpful. If it's an integrity-based violation, it's very harmful. This is irrespective of whether you're assessing these people as individuals or as groups. But probably the more interesting finding here is that the relative harshness of individuals and groups mattered. It was affected by the type of violation as well, and type of response. So that we can see here that when, in the first case, if they're offering what's essentially an optimal response, that's the dark gray line, so it's apology, it's a competence-based violation, and they're apologizing, this is the optimal response, there's really no difference between individuals and groups. But if they offer a suboptimal response, they deny culpability when they should have apologized, groups rear their ugly head and they become much less trusting than individuals. And then we find this again here for an integrity-based violation. If it's a matter of integrity, it's better to deny culpability than apologize. Here there's no significant difference when they offer an optimal response. When they offer a suboptimal response, groups be much harsher, right? So they rear their ugly head again at the collective level. These mediation hypotheses were supported. These effects are driven by the extent to which you express positive or negative sentiments, or supportive or unsupportive sentiments in that group context. And we have some interesting patterns with regard to the temporal dynamics, the sequencing of individual versus group decisions, that essentially what we find is that if your group assessments aren't affected by whether you make individual assessments first. So regardless of whether you appeal to that person individually prior to that group conversation, made no difference. But that group assessment, if you make a group assessment individually, that effect lingers to affect subsequent individual assessments. In fact, sometimes that subsequent individual assessment can be harsher. So there are important issues with regard to the dynamics here. So overall, from the study, what do we find? Groups are generally harsher than individuals. Both respond to this interaction of violation type and violation response. But the relative harshness, right, also depends on the appropriateness of this response. So this group versus individual decision format, the group nature of that interaction creates a reaction that magnifies the reactions individuals would have had on their own. These differences are the result of exposure to arguments, persuasive arguments, either supportive or unsupportive. And that whereas group assessments tend to persist, individual assessments tend not to. As soon as you move into the group context, that group sentiment takes hold. So what does this tell us? In general, we may be better off being judged by individuals than collectives. So even if, in today's modern times, you have a transgression that's publicized and everyone knows about it instantly, this is telling us that perhaps, despite that, we can't try to repair trust to everyone instantly as well. The repair process may have to tackle one individual at a time. It may be a much more arduous process. But this depends on the appropriateness of the response, right? So if you offer an appropriate response, then it doesn't matter, right? You can be judged by groups as well as individuals, and that may be less harmful, as long as you're offering the appropriate response. But if you choose to respond inappropriately, then this idea that you might try to sequester some individual members beforehand or afterwards to try to mitigate that sentiment, it's not going to help. Right? That group response is going to override any individual assessment. And so your best bet may be to limit the nature of the discussion, right? So fewer supported or unsupported arguments are expressed to the extent that you can. So I'm running out of time here. So I just want to leave, just sort of tie a knot around these studies with some concluding remarks and some questions as well. First, throughout all these studies, there's persistent evidence of this reversal that occurs based on the type of violation, right? Whether you respond to something that's framed as a matter of competence or integrity really matters. The essential thing to take note of here is that in all our studies, the actual transgression was the same. It was simply a misfiled tax return. In fact, we have other studies in which the incident is of a different nature, the transgression is different, but again, the cost of that transgression to the victim and the events that led to that transgression were identical. It was just simply framed as a competence or integrity related issue. And yet we get these dramatic reversals, right? This raises a question. When I talk to people, it's a very common sentiment that we believe that trust is so important for us to navigate our social worlds. If that's the case, why do we make these assessments so poorly, right? To the extent that our sentiments can be so dramatically affected by the way these incidents are framed, irrespective of the net damage of the transgression. And to the extent that there are these biases, does it encourage people to offer dishonest responses, knowing that some are going to be more effective than others? Should we do that, right? Should we choose the best response based on our findings, based on the type of violation? We would argue no, and I would point to one of the earlier studies I presented where evidence of innocence or guilt was provided. We find that if you're caught having lied, then you're in trouble as well. So it's not only ethically wrong, but strategically risky. Well, if that's the case, what should we do? Well, one thing is to recognize that most transgressions involve elements of competence and integrity. Right? And most things that go wrong in the world have multiple determining factors. Even in our study, the idea of misfiling a tax return because you didn't know the tax codes, well, maybe it's a result of some person being lazy and not having learned the tax codes, right? So you could always make that more of an integrity-based violation, or someone may have prevented that person from getting that tax information. So there are lots of ways in which to shape this attribution for this transgression. There are lots of causes of those transgressions. So this idea of, for those who wish to repair trust, the idea of framing this incident is something that Arnold Schwarzenegger got right? He recognized that how you frame it is important, but this is something that most of us don't do. And if you see the apologies that Toyota or other companies are giving nowadays, all these apologies are offering a response. Tiger Woods, that they're offering the response, but aren't so good about shaping the attribution. Right? And then for us as perceivers, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that we need to be particularly sensitive to the inherent attributions we're making for these types of transgressions, right? If these attributions matter so much, we need to be cognizant of the fact that in some cases we might lean toward an integrity-based attribution unnecessarily, right? Or inappropriately. or a competence-based violation inappropriately. We need to think about how our reactions might change if we have the different kind of attribution and think more carefully about the attributions we ultimately apply. So that's it today, and I can open the floor to questions.